The Dancing with Depression podcast is brought to you by CAS-CM, where CM stands for Content Matters, because content brings people together. Welcome to the Dancing with Depression podcast. I'm your host, Adam Turner. Today's episode is about timing and perspective, and what happens when our desire to help, share, or connect is ahead of where someone else's heart is ready to be. The core message is simple, but not easy. Growth creates distance. Perspective shapes meaning. Help is most effective when timing and readiness align. Over the past year, I've found myself in several situations that forced me to slow down and really sit with this truth. There have been moments where I invited people to share their personal experiences, not for attention, not for exposure, but because I genuinely believed their stories could help someone else take a step towards healing. And instead of excitement, I was met with hesitation, sometimes silence, sometimes resistance. One of the first moments I remember was when I invited Giselle to be a guest on the podcast. From my perspective, it felt obvious. She had spent nearly 3 decades helping people navigate fear, growth, and therapy. The very things this podcast exists to talk about. So when I asked her and saw hesitation instead of enthusiasm, I was confused. I remembered thinking, I'm asking you to talk about the work you've dedicated your life to. And yet, the excitement I felt wasn't mirrored back to me. Something similar happened when I extended an early invitation to another guest. Someone I deeply respected, who questioned what they had to offer and felt unsure. At first, I was confused, then taken aback, and if I'm honest, a little frustrated. Why didn't they see what I saw? I had to pause and ask myself a better question. What am I missing here? Because it wasn't that they didn't care. It wasn't that they didn't want to help. What I hadn't accounted for was timing. See, Giselle later shared she had never been on a podcast, and truthfully, never pictured herself on one. Suddenly, that fear of the unknown made perfect sense. How will I sound? What will I say? Will anyone care? What if I mess up? And here's the humbling part. Those were the exact same thoughts I had 2 years earlier when I first had the idea for this podcast. And it took me 6 months to finally record the very first episode. And that episode wasn't even an interview. It was just me explaining how the podcast came to be. So I had time to process. They hadn't. I wasn't wrong. I was just early. And this doesn't just happen in mental health conversations. We see timing matter in other areas of life too. Think about asking someone to marry you, starting a family, making a major life change. You can love someone deeply, but if the timing isn't right, the answer won't be what you hoped for. Not because the relationship isn't real, but because readiness isn't aligned. The same truth applies here. Another experience made this even clearer. There was someone I met during group therapy whose growth and insight had a profound impact on me. I believed her story could help others, so I asked if she'd consider sharing her journey on the podcast. At first, we were texting back and forth, responding very quickly, and then I asked the question and everything stopped. No reply. I didn't see the little bubbles letting me know she was responding. So my mind did what minds do. I started to ask myself, did I upset her? Did I cross the line? Did I just lose someone important to my healing? Eventually, the bubbles appeared and stayed there for what felt like hours. So I was anticipating a long response. But her response was honest. She just wasn't sure she'd be a great interview. She questioned whether her perspective translated well. She didn't even know what we'd talk about. And I tried explaining, reassuring, and removing any pressure she might have been putting on herself. Then she sent the message that gave me clarity. She thanked me and asked if we could revisit the idea after she finished her time in therapy. She was still actively processing, and the thought of sharing anything with anybody was simply impossible to comprehend. I felt awful, not because my intention was wrong, but because I hadn't considered timing. And that's where it really clicked. The resistance I encountered wasn't rejection, it wasn't disinterest, and it wasn't a lack of care. It was simply the difference in where we were in the process. I had time to process my fears. They were still inside theirs. Once there was time and space, movement became possible, just like healing itself. In simpler terms, people weren't saying no. They were saying, not there yet. So we know timing matters, but so does perspective. It was a time I reflected on losing friends in auto accidents before the age of 23 and how those losses shaped me. But those friends I lost weren't just part of my story. They had parents, siblings, partners. I hesitated to share those episodes directly with the people closest to them. I didn't want to reopen wounds or be responsible for causing pain. Months later, maybe even a year later, I shared this concern with Bobby. She paused and said, "But what if? What if sharing those stories didn't reopen wounds, but honored a life? What if it reminded someone that their loved one mattered so deeply they're still remembered 30 years later? What I feared might cause pain, she saw as comfort. Same story, different perspective." And I'm happy to share that I did reach out to some of the loved ones of those we lost too young. To say Bobby's perspective aligned with the outcome would be an understatement. What I received in return was an incredible gift, one I almost didn't give the opportunity to be given. I was able to have conversations that touched my heart deeply, and I now know touched theirs too. What I feared might cause harm instead created connection. We don't get to decide how someone else will experience something, but we do get to decide whether we give them that chance. Pain, comfort, and healing are deeply personal. It's human to want to help, especially when you've made progress and don't want someone else to struggle the way you once did. But growth also brings responsibility, not to lead, not to rush, but to walk beside. So I'll leave you with a few questions. Can you think of where you might be ahead of someone you care about? Have you mistaken readiness for resistance? Where might timing, not unwillingness, be the real factor? And how can you support someone without rushing them? Healing doesn't happen on our timeline. It happens when experience, time, and perspective finally meet. Sometimes the most compassionate thing we can do isn't to explain, fix, or guide, but to stay close, stay quiet, and trust that growth will come when it's ready. Okay, this is the part of the podcast where most people say, don't forget to like, share, leave a review, and follow. And yes, I'm going to say it too, and also thank those who have done just that. It's helping, and I can't thank you enough. The support helps bring in the right resources, partners, and opportunities that align with the Dancing with Depression mission, spreading understanding, compassion, and hope to anyone navigating their mental health journey. Also, it helps people find this show. When you like, share, comment, or follow, the algorithm does its thing. And that means someone who really needs this conversation, this story, or this moment have a better chance of discovering it. So if this podcast has ever made you feel seen, helped you reflect, or simply reminded that you're not alone, your engagement truly helps keep this going. My inbox is always open, so if you want to share a piece of your story, suggest a topic for a future episode, or just say hello, you can reach me anytime at dancingwithdepression@yahoo.com. And remember, when it comes to depression, take the lead. Thank you for joining us on another episode of Dancing with Depression. There's a saying that hindsight is 20/20, which is often used to describe the phenomenon of being able to see things more clearly after they've happened. With that in mind, I encourage you to reflect back on past experiences in an effort to better understand your now. Also, I invite you to share with me your comments, thoughts, or personal exposure to depression. You can email me at dancingwithdepression@yahoo.com. Until next time, keep moving forward, and when it comes to depression, remember to take the lead. The Dancing with Depression podcast may include discussions of suicide, self-harm, trauma, and emotional distress. Listener discretion advised. This podcast shares personal experiences and is not a substitute for professional mental health care. If you need immediate support, call or text 988, the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. For non-crisis help and resources, contact NAMI at 1-800-950-6264.